Okay, we have a number of people that have joined on now, but we'll go ahead and get started. It's top of the hour. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We'll try to wrap this up and be done and send you on your way by 1 o'clock. I'm Joe Stewart again, the Chief Advocacy Officer for the Independent Insurance Agents of North Carolina. Thank you for joining us for this first webinar on the 2026 elections. As we have in past election cycles, we want to provide information to our members on what's going on in North Carolina's electoral landscape to give you some sense of the key races to watch, the things that we're monitoring to make sure that we have a fuller understanding of what's likely to happen in an election. I've been doing this a long time. I say I'm not in the business of being able to accurately predict elections, but I can talk about the factors that may make various outcomes more or less likely to occur. And so I want to share that information with our members and get your feedback as well. So at the end, we'll take any questions that you want to submit by typing those into the system. All right. North Carolina, 2026 elections, a midterm election, meaning a non-presidential year election. In North Carolina, we have on the ballot a U.S. Senate contest, an open seat race. Thom Tillis, the incumbent senator, a Republican, made the decision last year to not run again in 2026. And so we will have to choose from two new people to determine who our next senator from North Carolina is. The state Supreme Court has one seat on the ballot, and three of the state's Court of Appeal seats are on the ballot, two of which the incumbent is running again. So one of those is an open seat contest as well. And of course, all 14 congressional districts, the representatives to the U.S. House for North Carolina, those run on a 2-year cycle, just like our legislature, our House and Senate, and the North Carolina General Assembly. All 170 of those seats will be on the ballot, although in a few of the seats, the incumbent did not have a challenger, and so they automatically win. If you don't have anybody run against you, you automatically win the race. And there's a few of those instances in the state legislative candidates, among the state legislative candidates this cycle. The key issues, typically in American politics, at least in the modern era, wave elections are considered to be more likely in midterm contests, those elections between presidential contests. A wave doesn't really have a technical definition. It simply means that there is momentum for one party's candidates, principally on congressional ballots, that result in a change in the partisan control of the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate. And so how big that wave possibly could be, and in history, we'll talk a little bit about this, going back 100 years or more, sometimes those waves have been great big waves, and one party's gained 20, 30, 40, 50 seats in Congress and Senate. Sometimes the waves are not very big, and only a handful of seats exchange partisan control. And some of those dynamics we'll be monitoring throughout this election cycle. There are a couple of our congressional races that may be in play in that regard, if it is, in fact, a wave election. And typically, what we've seen in the history of American politics is that the wave dynamic in a midterm election has a tendency to disfavor the party in control of the White House. And so we'll again talk a little bit about that going forward. But if there is a wave election, the conventional wisdom would be it will favor Democrats in this cycle, but we'll have to see. We'll talk about some of the factors that we're looking at in that regard. The second is the U.S. Senate race that is on the ballot. It will undoubtedly become the most expensive U.S. Senate race in American history. And of the last 8 U.S. Senate races that have been the most expensive U.S. Senate races in history to that point, 6 of them have been contested in North Carolina, in part because we are, and we'll again talk about this as well, a battleground state, from a partisan disposition of voters, a very competitive state. And the estimates now are that hundreds of millions of dollars are coming to North Carolina in support of and opposition to the two parties' candidates for that U.S. Senate seat. The third really is it's important to remember we are a fast-growing state by most estimates, about 120,000 new residents in North Carolina moving in from other parts of the country each year. And so that means about 150,000 of the people that will vote in the midterm elections in North Carolina did not live here in 2024. And so some part of what makes North Carolina a dynamic place to evaluate from a political standpoint is the fact that that growth means there's some portion of the electorate each cycle, and we simply don't have any history or knowledge of in terms of their disposition. We know what their voter registration is, we know where they live, and to some extent, we know where they came from, and that gives us a good basic understanding of what their politics might be but we have no real knowledge of how they perceive themselves as North Carolina voters. So that just makes it a little more complicated. As a starting point, I have what I call the surfer theory of elections. You have the candidate, which is like the surfer themselves. People want to know who that is and know a little bit about them, and they genuinely form an attachment to them one way or the other, positively or negatively. And so that matters a lot in terms of voters' sense of an election, who the candidates themselves are. And then you have the board, the campaign, and a great surfer can ride a really poorly constructed board successfully, and sometimes a really well constructed board can carry a less than adequate surfer safely to the shore. And so that's part of the dynamic that we look at as well, in addition to external dynamics like the factors that would constitute a wave election. Whether or not voters like a candidate, whether or not the campaign is well run, do have a tendency to make a difference in an election, generally speaking, all things otherwise being equal. And then this wave dynamic, sometimes that's like it is for a surfer, regardless of how good or bad the surfer is or how well constructed or poorly constructed the board is. There was just some dynamic in that election that was going to likely produce a particular outcome because voters were dramatically swayed one way or the other, just as a result of organic dynamics in a particular election. All right, real quickly, the North Carolina in which we live, from a political standpoint, the things to keep in mind. One, the historical sense of North Carolina, East versus West. We had Republicans in the western part of North Carolina and Democrats in the East, and there just were more Democrats because there was more of the population in the eastern part of the state. Really was a feature of the years following the Civil War. In terms of partisan identity, that was really more or less what motivated people to make the decision which party they belonged to through much of the 20th century. That shifted starting in the 1970s as the urban centers of North Carolina started to be the more significant growth parts of the state. And now that's really the dynamic that we face. People are increasingly making our bigger cities even bigger. And that's where the concentration of voters are. And that's really how the partisan and political dispositions are playing out. People that live in a city feel one way about their politics, and people that live in a rural part of the state feel another way about their politics. And North Carolina has been a determined urban state, more people living in a municipal jurisdiction than don't, since the 1990 census. But we have the largest rural population on a per capita basis of any state other than Texas. And so, in part, we're not purple because every single county has an even balance of Democrat and Republican minded voters. It's because there's more or less an equal amount of voter participation between urban and rural parts of the state, where Republicans do much better in rural counties and Democrats do much better in urban counties. And the battlegrounds have really become those suburbs, places just outside of an urban area, sort of between the cities and in the country. That's where voters that can be convinced to vote for either party's candidates given a particular dynamic. And in a wave election, that's really where you're going to see voters who make the difference, people that would be willing to consider voting for any party's candidates based on a particular set of issues or attitudes for that particular election. The whole sense of what it means to be Republican and Democratic and to be conservative and liberal, those sorts of dynamics are also changing in their definition. Younger generation Americans in particular do not necessarily align on the same public policy basis to make what we would consider historically the choice to be a Democrat or Republican. There's a little bit of difference of opinion on those public policy issues that older generation Americans like me consider to be the real litmus test of whether or not someone was likely to vote for a Democratic or a Republican candidate. That creates a different dimension for us in our state too. And the increasing internationalization of North Carolina is now, excuse me, a cricket facility in Morrisville, North Carolina, outside of Raleigh, where international cricket competitions are held. And so that really has become a way of understanding what matters to North Carolinians. We are a part of the global economy. We're very concerned. There are growing communities of people in North Carolina that are originally from other countries, and they have become American citizens and vote in our elections. The town of Morrisville, now more than a quarter of the people who vote in that city are Indian Americans, people that have come to this country from the country of India. And so that changes the electoral dynamic a little bit, just in terms of people's disposition being informed more about their experience having come here from another part of the world. And finally, technology continues to cast a long shadow. As George Jetson turns 4 years old this year, the original show, which aired in 1960, was set in 2060, and Jetson is 40 years old in the show, so that would make him in 2026 4 years old. But the example is really intended to prove that the way technology is advancing is not only affecting our culture and our society and our economy, it's affecting the way people think about public policy issues, and principally younger generation Americans who've only ever known a world where they can communicate using the internet and social media. And so those sorts of advances are starting to have an influence on our elections as well. Looking at the state's demographics, this is from the Census Bureau data. The North Carolina North Carolina, the UNC Population Center at UNC Chapel Hill has a North Carolina demography program run by Dr. Nathan Dollar, and they do assessments and evaluations of all of the census data and other relevant analytical data on the population in North Carolina. But if you look at us, we're a state that's getting slightly older. The median age has crept up over the last several years. The distribution on age cohort basis of gender is more or less consistent with the rest of the country. And then the racial and ethnic composition of the state, as you can see from this chart, about 62% of the population is white, a little over 21% is Black, and 10% Hispanic, and Indian Americans and Asian, which would include the population of folks from the country of India. But this is the most important dynamic, I think, to say. Now, here's the same breakout of the demography of North Carolina as a whole. But if you look at the population under the age of 4 of people currently living in North Carolina under the age of 4, you see that it's almost 20% Hispanic. And so the diversity is a common, and a large portion of that population are native-born North Carolinians, and they may have come with mom and dad who were not here lawfully, but those kids were born in North Carolina and ostensibly will have voting rights when they turn 18. And so that dynamic of such a significant portion of the electorate being first-generation Americans is going to be another aspect of North Carolina's politics in the future that we just don't have any experience with. We've never been a state that had large portions of the electorate being first-generation Americans. So those are all just factors to keep in mind as we think about North Carolina's political landscape. We start to see this manifest itself, increased number of Hispanic Americans running for public office at the local level. That's an interesting dynamic. And again, alluding to this change of attitude among younger generation Americans, we saw a shift a little bit to sort of typically in recent modern political history in this country. Younger people had a tendency to be more likely to vote Democratic, and that shifted in the last several presidential election cycles somewhat. And I think most notably, it's the fact that a younger generation of voters are getting more of their information not from what we would consider to be traditional sources on news and other things and help inform their and shape their opinion as voters. They're getting this information from each other. They're sharing informations, attitudes, and opinions, and even to the extent they feel the ability to be a reporter is to provide information that they consider to be an objective assessment of things that are taking place. But they are informing themselves and each other a lot more than they are being informed by external sources. And in terms of their voter attitudes, that's really the basis more than what my generation did, watch the evening news, and that's how we got our information. So it's different in many ways, but it's particularly different that the sources are they themselves and not necessarily other third parties. All right, so looking at this growth of North Carolina, this map shows by coloration the anticipated growth going forward. This is based on Census Bureau data. And so you can see the darker colored counties, it is principally a continued influx of people into the urban centers of the state. Charlotte and in Raleigh, you see that in and around Wilmington is another dynamic, Asheville as being a part of that. But here's the thing to keep in mind. If you look at these 12 counties, that's half of the state's voters. Half of the people that are registered to vote in North Carolina live in just 12 counties. And that number of counties, as the state continues to urbanize, is going to get smaller and smaller. Wake and Mecklenburg counties now combined are about a full 25% of all registered voters in the state and remain fast-growing counties in the state. But you see, like in Brunswick County there in the southeastern corner of the state, that's a very fast-growing county, but it's mostly retirees. So the average age in Brunswick County of someone is the highest in the state, but it's the fastest growing, but it's a very specific demography that's moving into Brunswick County, where the dark county above Wake County there, Franklin County, that's more people moving in to that community, families that have one or both of the spouses moving to North Carolina as a result of some job opportunity in the Research Triangle area of the state. So the continued urbanization is going to be a dynamic for our elections going forward, and how it influences the state's political dimensions. We'll talk a little bit about here too. What we've already witnessed is likely to continue to occur. So here's the breakout of the demography of our registered voters. And you can see, even though 10% of the state is Hispanic, only about 4% of the registered voters are. Now, there are other categories like multiracial and other and not disclosed. So it may be that the actual percentage of registered voters that are Hispanic is slightly higher than that. But you can see it's not reflective of the population, because some portion of the Hispanic population in the state are not eligible voters because they're not residents of the United States. But the source of these folks coming into the country, you can see Mexico and India now the two largest contributors in terms of people moving in from other parts of the state. And the chart of the state there shows the percentage of children in a particular county who have at least one foreign-born parent. And so the internationalization of our voter dispositions will be influenced by the fact that an increasing number of the people living in the state have at least one parent who is from some other part of the world. And so, again, the continued internationalization of our disposition is a very likely dynamic in our politics. Now, this goes back to June of last year, where the Republican Party was commenting on the fact that it looked as though the trend lines would produce the Republican registration in the state would exceed that of the Democratic registration sometime soon. And in fact, that's now come to pass. Here's the voter registration. As you can see, Democrats about 2.3 million, Republicans 2.3 million, but a few thousand more than Democrats. So it's still each about 30% of the total of all registered voters. But it is true that registered Republicans now are greater in number than registered Democrats. Now, the other dynamic is you see the unaffiliated numbers. That's almost 40% of all registered voters have chosen not to designate in one party or the other, or any of the parties that you're eligible to register for as a voter in North Carolina. And so the question is often asked, does that mean those unaffiliated voters are independent? Well, the truth is they're probably not. That they do have a partisan disposition, meaning they're more likely to vote for a Democratic candidate or more likely to vote for a Republican candidate. They've just chosen to register as unaffiliated. And because unaffiliated voters in North Carolina can participate in any of the partisan primary elections, being an unaffiliated voter doesn't keep you from participating in the process of determining who the party's candidates are through the primary election. So, but the chart behind all of this comes from Paul Shoemaker's Republican consultant friend. And he's done this over the 30 years or so that he's been doing polling for various candidates. And it's basically this one question. Do you consider yourself, regardless of your registration, a Democrat, a Republican, or unaffiliated? And do you consider yourself conservative, liberal, or moderate? And so charting this over time, you can see going up, the more conservative, going down, the more liberal. And the top line shows self-identified Republicans remaining pretty conservative in their self-analysis over the last 30 years. The black and the purple lines in the middle, black is the average, purple is the portion of the electorate that's unaffiliated, identifies as unaffiliated. And that, interestingly enough, from an ideological standpoint, has remained pretty comparable. On average, North Carolinians remain sort of right of center conservative. It's dipped a little in part over the last 3 decades in terms of where it's come from on a relative conservative versus liberal basis, but it's still more or less right of center. So the average ideological disposition in the state is still right of center somewhat. But you can see the blue line at the bottom, those are self-identified Democrats. And they've gone from 30 years ago, they themselves, self-identified Democrats, describing themselves as being at least right of center, on average, a conservative Democrat. And now it is far more liberal. And I think that's just a function of having large cities. We've seen across America, it's very common for large concentrations of populations to have a more liberal ideological disposition. And there are lots of schools of thought about why that might be. But the truth is, this is not a historic dynamic of North Carolina, but neither has been being a state of large cities. And so part of what's happened in the modern North Carolina, we have something we never had before. We have urban liberals. And so we just have to recognize that's part of the dynamic of our politics these days. Okay, thinking about the landscape, voters in any election have a tendency to focus on economic issues unless there is some other overwhelming issue, principally national security, that sort of outweighs whatever individual consideration a voter might have about their sense of the economy and their own personal financial well-being. And North Carolina's had some great stories to tell about its economy over the last several years. So the assumption might be North Carolina voters going in this election are feeling pretty positive about the state of the state's economy. We've had lots of job creation here, companies moving here. It seemingly is a great backdrop for the voter attitudes in this particular election cycle to be relatively positive about the economy. And the reason why that matters is typically when voters feel generally positive about the economy, that bodes well for incumbents of both parties. Candidates running for office who were in office that created the environment where voters felt like the economy was good can take credit for that. And so typically wave elections have been more dynamic when there's less optimism among voters about the economy. But North Carolina, pretty good stories about the economy in the last few years. Now, if you look at the economy by comparison, and this is a chart that is partisan by its nature, but it does demonstrate that in particular, the dynamic of our politics right now is a lot of juxtaposition of the previous Democratic administration and the current Republican administration, mostly by the current Republican administration. But that having been said, we've had a good run in the economy. You can see the amount of market capitalization in the stock market is a steady growth since the years of COVID. People feeling pretty positive. We went through a tough time with dramatic inflationary pressure emerging during COVID that's stabilized to some extent. But when we talk about the economy, we don't mean a voter's perception of the overall economy. It means people's individual perception about how the economy is impacting them personally. And so it is far more likely that voters think about the price of gas and food and what they're spending on utilities, the how much it costs to go out for the evening, what is the expense horizon that they face in terms of all of the things they have in front of them, the college education for their children or the expense of vocational instruction, those sorts of things. So no matter what the actual economy is, people have a tendency to be more reflective on their own individual experiences. And so why things like the price of eggs and the price of gas matter to voters is that's something that they have firsthand and real experience with and use as a barometer to determine whether they think, in effect, the economy is good or not. And if they don't think the economy is good, they'll be looking to the candidates challenging incumbents to come up with some way to describe what that person might do to make the economy for that individual voter better, should that individual voter choose to vote for them. Here's the chart showing what's driving inflationary pressure. We've seen a resurgence in the price of goods, to some extent, services, energy costs, maybe driving that a little bit. We've seen fuel prices, gasoline most principally, go down in the last couple of last year or so. And so the inflationary pressure may or may not be what's driving voter attitudes in terms of the economy now. It may be more this. And this is from an article, the word affordability and how much candidates are using it of both parties to talk to voters about economic issues is a significant factor. And I think as we head into the heart of the 2026 election cycle, it's this issue of affordability, which is a very subjective term, but I think candidates will use it to try to either attack incumbents or to propose things that their party is doing or proposing to do differently than the other party in the context of what does the individual voter perceive as the cost of things that they have on their kitchen table, having to sort through the bills. And so that sense of affordability, can you do the things that you want to do economically, is probably going to be front and center, principally, I would think, among the Democratic candidates for office this year, as a way of saying that the Trump administration and Donald Trump as a candidate for president in 2024 talked a lot about bringing down the prices of goods and services and food and fuel and those sorts of things. And the Democrats trying to make the case that he's not honored that campaign pledge from the 2024 election. And that would be their case for why folks need to vote for Democrats in 2026. So this particular president has developed a kind of political sense of himself. People feel dramatic passion both for and against him, and I think that has played out in previous elections. Of course, Donald Trump was president after the 2016 election and then lost to Joe Biden in 2020 and is now returned into office, but clearly is the most identifiable candidate relative to people is it relates to the Republican Party as a whole. But it has been true throughout American political history, North Carolina political history, very dynamic political figures like Donald Trump. There is a certain half-life where the amount of impact they have in politics diminishes ultimately as they leave public office and go into private life. Their influence is diminished. But that clearly becomes a dynamic, and Donald Trump's not eligible to run for re-election again after the 2028 presidential campaign. And so we might see this as a factor, as sort of the relative sphere of influence Donald Trump has, the shadow that he casts over our politics may continue to diminish and may not be as significant a factor after the 2026 elections. But we'll have to see. But people do have strong feelings about Donald Trump, either for or against him, but they still are influenced by the typical issues that influence voters, like the economy, the state of affairs in the world, their own sense of partisan disposition, and increasingly what they hear from the various trusted sources they have, principally in social media, for content relative to the American politics. But all of this mixes together and creates kind of a soup for what influences voter attitudes in any given election cycle. And so, what really matters, the bottom line for the 2026 election, it's a relatively small handful of voters that are willing to even consider voting for a candidate of one party or the other if they consider themselves to be more likely to support a Republican candidate. There's a very small percentage of those voters are willing to say they'd vote for a Democrat and vice versa. And so I'm not sure the wave dynamic shapes up as it might have in previous years, just because people are so strongly entrenched either for or against Donald Trump and thus unwilling to vote for a candidate of his party or not in terms of their own identity as a voter. The president's approval has sort of hovered, has diminished a little bit since he came into office in January of last year, but that's true of every president, more or less. Their popularity is waned a little. It's not waned among Republicans significantly. It's diminished a little bit among that cohort of independent-minded voters. But people are now so partisan locked in. The perception of the president is really a reflection of that as much as anything, as you can see on the various issues. A little attrition among Republicans on some of the other issues like healthcare and Ukraine. But generally speaking, the president still remains very popular among Republican-minded voters. But in a midterm election, it's that portion of unaffiliated voters that have the greatest potential to influence the outcome because of their willingness to consider voting for candidates of one party or the other. And interestingly enough, national Democratic political consultants are advising Democratic candidates not to talk about Donald Trump in this election, but to remain focused on this issue of affordability. And so we'll see if Democratic candidates can remain disciplined in that regard and focus in a laser-like way on economic issues that I think this national consultant said, what voters say they're interested in hearing from Democrats about is what is your alternative plan to what Donald Trump has done that would definitively continue to lower the prices of goods and services that we bear as consumers. And so typically discipline is something that is very hard for candidates of either party to maintain throughout a very hard fought political cycle. So we'll just see if that is a factor. And then again, the bottom line, not every voter turns out. We know that there's a cohort of voters that are very loyal in their support for Donald Trump, or the MAGA portion of the Republican Party. Typically, Donald Trump not being on the ballot personally has proven to not be as helpful to Republican candidates as when he's on the ballot in terms of that cohort of voters and their likelihood of turning out. The Democrats need to have a greater level of enthusiasm among their voters, a belief that participating in the election has a real definitive opportunity to change the outcome of either partisan control of the state legislature or Congress. And we'll see. Democratic voters at this point in polling seem to be enthusiastic about this election, but we still have quite a ways to go before Election Day. And then, of course, for Republicans to do well, they need Republican voters to turn out, not just the cohort of people that are very loyal to Donald Trump, but rank and file, typical, usual Republican voters. And then that swing portion of the electorate, principally in the suburbs and what we call ex-urban, meaning sort of rural areas that are in the cusp of a metropolitan area. But North Carolina is not purple because every county is equally balanced between people likely to vote for Democrats and likely to vote for Republicans. It's purple because the urban areas and the rural areas are more or less equal at this point. So who turns out matters a lot because the composite of the total votes cast will be the individual sums of these various components of the electorate. And that portion of the voters who are willing to consider voting for both parties' candidates is relatively small, probably less than 5% of the voters. And so whether or not they're inspired to turn out and who they're inspired to turn out for becomes a really significant issue, principally in the statewide races that are on the ballot in 2026. As you can see, the turnout in elections, presidential contest years have a tendency to turn out more voters. We've had an increase. We hover around 70% or so in presidential contests. We're really good. Midterm elections is closer to 50% of registered voters that turn out. Because we have a U.S. Senate race on the ballot, that means there's a lot of money spent on an up ballot race. And so more voters are informed and engaged and involved in the election process. I think that the turnout will be more or less consistent with what we've seen in mid-cycle elections where there's a U.S. Senate race. So somewhere between 50 and 60% of the voters would turn out would be my guess at this point. Then again, pointing to this issue of the history of midterm elections, if you go back to George Bush and the midterm elections of his presidency, Republicans lost seats in Congress there. Barack Obama's 8 years as president in the 2010 election, famously, President Obama said that the Democrats took a shellacking, a huge loss in a massive wave election that turned over control of Congress to the Republicans at that time. Something of a wave election in the 2018 midterm, the first midterm for Donald Trump, and a slightly lesser wave in 2022 when Joe Biden was president. So there's this sense of it, whether or not it's in a wave election, is proven by history to be more or less consistent from presidency to presidency. So, but the dynamic here is the Trump administration and President Trump himself has called on states to redistrict their congressional seats to try to forestall the impact of a wave. And a number of states have done that. So far, of the states that redistricted, it's a net gain of 3 for the Republicans. And we'll talk a little bit about what it means to say a district leans one direction or the other. But it's still the composition of Congress is pretty close at this point between Democrats and Republicans. And so it wouldn't have to be a great big wave to change the balance of power. But there are fewer and fewer places where there are enough voters that are interested in considering voting for one party's candidates or the other, I think, to make a wave election seem a lot less likely for either party, at least in the near term of American politics. So looking at the current composition of Congress, 220 seats in the U.S. House held by Republicans, 215 by Democrats. The Democrats need to pick up 3 seats. They're targeting 39 of the seats in Congress, and 28 of those were districts where Donald Trump won the majority of votes in the 2024 election by 5 points or more. So it's not insurmountable for Democrats. It doesn't have to be a great big wave for them to be able to take control of the U.S. House. But I don't think it's not necessarily at this point a given that this wave dynamic is going to play out. The other complicating factor for Republicans, there's currently 2 seats vacant that were held by Republicans. One, Representative LaMalfa from California recently just passed away, but it makes the margins much smaller, at least in the near term, in terms of getting any legislation enacted on a party line vote in the U.S. House. So we'll see in the Senate. Currently, Republicans hold 53 of the 100 seats. Of the U.S. Senate seats that are on the ballot, 13 are in current Democratic incumbents in states that Donald Trump won in Michigan and Georgia. And of the 22 Republican-held seats, Kamala Harris won in Maine. And so you can see the chart below that from the Charlie Cook report. These are the predictions of the relative competitiveness of the various U.S. Senate races. You can see North Carolina is listed as one of those states that's considered a toss-up, and that's just because of the relatively competitive nature of North Carolina on a partisan basis. So the fact that we have a U.S. Senate race, the fact that it's an open seat race, the question is ultimately looking at the whole map of the United States, does whether or not North Carolina's partisan control of that Senate seat shift from Republican to Democrat as a result of this election? Does it really have the potential to change the ultimate partisan balance in the Senate? And that calculation is, particularly as we get closer to Election Day, maybe what drives whether or not larger and larger sums of money are spent in North Carolina. All right, looking at our U.S. Senate race, Roy Cooper, former Democratic governor, is in the race, as is Michael Whatley, former Republican Party chairman and National Republican Party chair as well. And so the matchup is kind of interesting. There are other candidates on the ballot, 6 Democrats total, including Cooper, and 7 Republicans total, including Whatley. And that includes Michelle Morrow, who was a candidate for superintendent of public instruction, having taken out Catherine Truitt in the Republican primary of 2024 and came up short against Mo Green, who went on to win as superintendent of public instruction. But it is at least a candidate in the Republican primary for the U.S. Senate that has some voter recognition. People have voted for Michelle Morrow before, so they'll recognize the name perhaps a little more easily. I don't think at this point it's a serious challenge to Whatley, and Donald Trump has endorsed Michael Whatley. And I think the sense was he starts out as a significant front runner in terms of getting the Republican nomination, but having another candidate file that has at least run on a statewide basis once before maybe makes it a little more interesting than it might have otherwise been. In the matchup between Roy Cooper and Michael Whatley, Roy Cooper's been in public service nearly more than 40 years, never lost an election that he's run for, served in the state house and the state senate, and then it was attorney general and then governor. Michael Whatley, no electoral experience. So it really will be a 40-year public service career of Roy Cooper versus no public record of Michael Whatley. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It might be a good juxtaposition for Whatley to be able to point to the fact that he comes at this as someone not having spent their entire career in politics. So we'll see how that plays out in terms of the comparison voters make of these two candidates. What are the issues? Well, certainly in federal elections, people have a tendency to be more focused on national and international issues than just North Carolina-centric issues. And a lot of stuff is percolating, not the least of which is the economy, and certainly border security, foreign affairs become a lot more robust in the last week or so. National security issues, much the same. And so these are probably likely to be the topics that are discussed much between these candidates as they campaign. At this point, the conservative estimate is that about $700 million will come into North Carolina between the two campaigns and the outside groups that are likely to weigh in support of an opposition to these two candidates. Significant sum of money, and why that matters is the volume of advertising that's being done. One, it maybe creates a difference in voters' minds in terms of down ballot candidates of the two U.S. Senate candidates party. And that much money being spent in the states has a tendency to eclipse the availability of airtime for other down ballot candidates. And so voter recognition of a candidate running for the state legislature or some local office may be less informed as a result of so much of the capacity of advertising being taken up by all that money being sent in the Senate race. And again, as I mentioned before, we get down to the final stretch, looking at the rest of the country and where there are other hot Senate or U.S. Senate races taking place. If it does not look like North Carolina's race is going to make a difference, it may be that some of that $700 million never ultimately is delivered to or spent in North Carolina. But that's something we'll have to monitor and look at a little closer to Election Day. All right, the starting point, Donald Trump, this is from polling done back just before the first of the year by the Carolina Journal, the interesting things to me, if you look at the approval of Donald Trump, it's shifted a little bit since his inaugural in January of 2025, but it's not significantly different. It's still about 46% approve and 53% do not approve of the way the president's conducting himself in that office. But you can see that only 1.5% of the people polled don't have an opinion. People have locked in. They've made their decision about Donald Trump. And so that's a pretty significant factor. Interesting enough, Josh Stein, the Democratic governor, is not on the ballot, but certainly there's an impression that voters have of Democrats as a result of their impression of the Democratic governor. His numbers are not that dissimilar from Donald Trump's. And the difference is being that still about a fifth of all voters don't have an opinion of their governor yet. They just don't know Stein being in his first term. The other polling result that I look very closely at is what we call the generic ballot. People are asked the question, regardless of who the candidate is, do you plan to vote for the Democratic or the Republican candidate for the state legislature and for Congress? And if you look at the generic ballot, typically in North Carolina, when the question is asked about state legislative races, Democrats generally do a little better than Republicans in this statistic. And generally, if Republicans are within 3, 4, 5 percentage points of Democrats, then it's not really an indication that there's a wave dynamic forming among among voters. The issue here is to look at how unaffiliated voters, that small portion of the electorate that might be willing to consider to vote for one party's candidates or the other based on some external factor. But at this point, I don't see anything in this polling that would indicate the beginnings of a dynamic wave election. But typically, it's in the summer months where those movements start to take place. A lot of times, those unaffiliated, truly unaffiliated voters don't begin to form their opinion about how they're going to perform as voters until sort of that final corridor of the summer when the election's starting to get to be real to the average person. So Roy Cooper is the candidate for Senate. What is likely to be the attack? Well, he was governor during COVID, so any of his actions during COVID are likely to be discussed and debated. The sense of he is a Democratic governor, where was he on crime and criminal justice related issues? That is likely to be discussed and debated. His comparison with Joe Biden and during that period of time and on an economic basis, how was the economy in North Carolina? Were we doing better than the rest of the country? Will become a question there. And then trying to align Roy Cooper with other more progressive, liberal-minded Democrats on the national stage to try to make the case that Roy Cooper is not, he's out of the mainstream for North Carolina. He's more like these well-known, very progressive and liberal-minded Democrats. Michael Whatley on the other side is a former lobbyist, and that's likely to be raised as, is he really an outsider, or is he just somebody that's been in politics for his own benefit for a long time? And as party chair, very supportive of early on of the Republican candidate for governor, Mark Robinson, who had a disastrously bad campaign and lost under terrible circumstances in 2024. And of course, the alignment with Donald Trump as the national chairman. And I think the Democratic strategies, despite their political consultants telling them not to talk about Donald Trump in this election, that's very likely to be the bulwark of the attacks on Michael Whatley, is to try to convince that small portion of independent-minded voters that Michael Whatley's too aligned with Donald Trump, and the North Carolina Senate seat needs to be filled with somebody that'll be more seeking a balance against the policies of Donald Trump. And then, interestingly enough, the relief efforts for Hurricane Helene, the western part of the state, is pretty concentrated portion of the state's Republican base of voters. So there may be some the discussion about the lack of funding coming out of the federal government for hurricane recovery efforts in the West, and blaming that on Michael Whatley to some extent. If you look at the polling in the Senate race, Roy Cooper has more or less consistently been up a few percentage points. Although this is very interesting, despite the fact that Michael Whatley has not really served in public office before, he still has a pretty significant portion of the base. This is probably a reflection of the fact that Republican voters are very committed to voting for Republican candidates, even if they don't know them, which has not historically been the case. A lot of times voters, even if they're likely to end up voting for a candidate of one party or the other, if they don't know the person, they hesitate until they get to know them a little better through advertising. But I think this is probably an accurate. Real Clear Politics does an aggregation of all of the polling. And so on average, Roy Cooper's up about 5 percentage points with about 13% undecided at this point, which is probably correct. It's going to be the foot race to who can win over that 13% of undecided voters that may decide the Senate race. This is the average of the national generic question on congressional race. You can see the general attitude about Congress is unfavorable, even among Republicans, and Republicans control both the Senate and the House. And so this does feel a little wavish when a party doesn't feel positive about their own party's control of Congress. That sometimes is a symptom that the base Republican voters are not as likely to turn out and vote in a particular cycle, which might fuel, at least in part, a wave election dynamic. But at this point, I'm not sure that matters even among Democrats. Democrats feeling, well, the other party controls Congress, so we definitely need to turn out to try to do that. I'm not sure Democrats feel that way at this point because it's just so generally a sense of mistrust of large institutions in this country. The unfavorable opinion of Congress is not surprising. But again, sometimes it comes down to the two candidates. You may not want to, you may be a member of the Bugs Bunny party, and so you're only ever going to vote for the Bugs Bunny candidate, but that particular party's candidate is not desirable to you for one reason or another, and so you're willing to vote for the Daffy Duck party candidate, and it's just because you don't like the other party's candidate. Some of the candidates still matter, like my surfer analogy. Sometimes the surfer matters more to some portion of the electorate than whether or not they're aligned with a particular party. All right, looking at those congressional seats, 14 right now. Currently, we have 4 Democrats of 14 in those seats. The districts are drawn in such a way that they're very likely to produce a particular outcome in the election, and that is driven by that assessment by a review of the historical voting patterns among people who live in those districts, and it's done for both congressional and for state legislative districts. It just means that over time that the voters have typically supported one party's candidate or the other consistently, election cycle after election cycle. So when we talk about a district leaning one way or the other, or being very likely or safe for a Democrat or safe for a Republican, it's based on that assessment of what the voters who actually live there have proven historically is their genuine partisan disposition. And so the districts, such as they were, John Davis, the Democratic incumbent, even though it was a slightly Republican-leaning district, it was the most competitive of the 14, the others being drawn more favorably for one party or the other. But the General Assembly decided, as the president had suggested, to look at redrawing the maps, and they did, and most notably changed the voter composition of the first and the third districts to make the first district slightly more friendly to a Republican candidate. Now, what that did in effect was now Chuck Edwards in the 11th district, Republican incumbent there, that's the most competitive district. And it still leans Republican, but it doesn't lean Republican by as much as the newly drawn first congressional district does. And so here's the analysis for all of the 14 congressional districts. The R plus or D plus number just means consistently voters in that district have supported the Democratic candidates in statewide offices by that percentage point. So the first district, R plus 5, means over time, on average, Republican candidates in statewide contest have gotten 5 percentage points more in the vote in the first district than that candidate did overall on a statewide basis. So that is considered something of a metric that would identify the partisan disposition and likely outcome in a particular district. So there's all 14 districts, such as they are, with the ratings and what the margin historically has been for the candidates in one party. But you can see, generally speaking, all of the districts pretty much are drawn so that a candidate of one party or the other is more likely, all other things being equal outside of a wave election dynamic. Those districts are pretty much likely to go one way or the other based on the historical voting patterns. Now, the 2 races to watch of the 14, of course, the first district now, which has been made slightly more Republican friendly. Don Davis has no Democratic primary opponent. There are 5 Republicans running against, including State Senator Bobby Hanig, who was in the General Assembly, made the decision to run. Lori Buckhout ran against Davis in the 2024 election and came up short. And there is one Libertarian Party candidate, no primary there. So Mr. Bailey will be on the ticket in the fall. But the 11th district, Chuck Edwards does have a Republican opponent, although I don't think he'll have any problem winning that primary. He also has 5 members of the opposition party running against him, 1 Libertarian and 1 independent voter who has to get a certain number of signatures from the registered voters in that district to be able to be on the ballot in November. But these are the 2 contests that will, in all likelihood, be the races to watch, just because of the potential, given the margins. There you see the +5 in the first district and +4. If the wave dynamic that favors Democrats is significant enough, it may actually put these 2 districts in play. And the fact that the first district is slightly more Republican. If the wave is not as dynamic, then the potential of a Republican upset of Don Davis is slightly greater. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look at these same ratings over time, they're influenced also by other dynamics that take place in the districts, the growth, where the voters came from and such. But all of these four districts, three of which are currently held by Republicans, have had their rating changed based on this updated analysis. And so the 8th district, where Mark Harris is the incumbent, the 7th district with David Rouzer, and the 3rd district with Dr. Greg Murphy are now slightly less Republican performance than they were previously. In the Don Davis district, which was literally a toss-up before, now does lean Republican. So to some extent, to change where the counties are configured within a congressional district ultimately means some other counties may become less likely to produce an incumbent in one part or the other. And so we'll have to watch these races over the next couple of election cycles to see if, in fact, the three districts that are now slightly less Republican continue on that trajectory, meaning the balance within our congressional district on a party line vote may be shifted somewhat. All right, look at the General Assembly. Still no budget. Doesn't look like we'll have a budget for the state of North Carolina until the legislature comes back for what's called the short session in April, which starts on April 21st. There's still a lot of political tension between the House and the Senate, not just over budgetary issues, but over some other dynamics. But the 5 members of IIANC that serve in the General Assembly, what we call our agent caucus. 2 have dynamics to watch. Chris Humphrey, who's a House member, has the most competitive district of any of the 5 of these of our agent caucus members. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that. And then Jim Bergen has a Republican primary opponent, although I don't think he'll have any problem in that race. But eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, as Thomas Jefferson said. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that. We do have other members of the General Assembly, not active insurance agents, but have insurance as a background. Senator Bradley from Mecklenburg County used to be a PNC licensed agent. She now does real estate. But John Bell, who is the chairman of the House Rules Committee, Speaker Destin Hall is actually a graduate of the Brantley Risk Management Program at Appalachian State. Representative Jackson used to be an insurance agency owner, is now a minister, and Representative Pless from the mountains used to work for Farm Bureau, although he doesn't anymore. But so we have, beyond our actual members who are involved in the management of an independent agency, there are other legislators with good insurance experience. And so we're always glad to be able to have those allies in the General Assembly. In addition, in this cycle, there's 2 additional insurance agents, Greg Edds, who's actually State Farm agency owner, so not an independent agent, and then Dan Scalise, who works for a benefits agency that is a member of IIANC. So they're both in Republican performance districts. Neither one has a Republican primary. So I think it's very likely in January of 2027, when the new General Assembly comes into session, we'll have 2 additional insurance agents serving in the State House, which is beneficial. Even Ed's, who's not an independent agent, would be a good voice on insurance issues of common interest. All right, looking at the legislature, again, looking at the historical partisan performance of voters, that is how this chart is put together in terms of whether a district's considered to be good for Democrats or good for Republicans, or just a toss-up, meaning that the historical voting patterns don't favor one party or the other. But coming into this election, Republicans needed to win 2 seats in addition to all the seats that had some Republican leaning. And then in the House, there were need for 3 seats. And it turned out to the supermajority, which is the 3/5 needed to override a gubernatorial veto on a party line vote, with what's considered to be one party or the other's ability to dominate the legislative agenda for the state. The Republicans got to the supermajority number in the Senate, but came up 1 short in the House. And Speaker Hall said that they had a practical supermajority at 71, even though they needed 72 votes, because there were a handful of Democrats who were willing to cross over and vote with Republicans on particular overrides. And that happened not for all of the bills that Governor Stein vetoed, but for some. Now, one of those, Cecil Brockman, has resigned his seat, had a little bit of a scandal and got arrested, and so decided to resign his seat, so will not be returning to the General Assembly. Carla Cunningham, a Democrat from Mecklenburg County, has 2 Democratic opponents in the primary, one of whom has been endorsed by Governor Stein, so faces a bit of a challenge there. And both of the other 2, Shelley Willingham and Mohammed Naheed from Mecklenburg County, both have Democratic primary challenges as well. And so that sense that they were willing to cross over and vote with Republicans has been responded to within their own party by incurring Democratic challengers to their incumbency. We'll see if that makes a difference. And if Governor Stein's endorsement of Representative Cunningham's opponent proves to be what it takes for him to be successful, it might send a signal to other Democrats of the peril that they might face in crossing over with Republicans on future votes. Now, look at the 2026 elections. The analysis of the districts has shifted a little bit, so it's not as necessarily favorable to a Republican supermajority as it was in the 2024 election cycle. But a wave election doesn't mean one thing. I mean, it could be a great big wave, and I think if it's a great big wave, then there is at least the possibility of a Democratic majority in the General Assembly. It's not probable, but it is certainly possible. But it would be a great big wave that would be necessary for that to happen. You might have a little bit of a wave where a few seats change control. And at that point, you might still have a practical supermajority for the Republicans, or it might be somewhere in the middle where it's not a supermajority for Republicans, but they do enjoy a numerical majority. And so for the Democrats to have that kind of dynamic, they would have to win every single seat that leans Democratic at some level or not. All of the seats that are toss-up, which include in the House 2 Republican incumbents and 5 Republican incumbents I'm 5 in the House and 2 in the Senate, and then eat into districts that lean Republican or likely, meaning it's still possible for a Republican to win, but in that great big wave, it's just numerically very difficult to imagine that the Democrats can do this, but the size of the wave will matter. And I don't think we know yet if the wave is going to happen at all. And if it does happen, what size of it is. But that just sort of gives you the range of possible outcomes, such as we might imagine at this point, based on the historical voting patterns in these districts. In the Senate, there's 4 really key races that everyone's watching, 3 in the toss-up category, of which 2 are held by Republicans currently, Michael Lee in New Hanover County and Lisa Barnes in Nash County. Those are considered probably the greatest possible seats for Democrats to come in and win, I think, at this point. In the Chris Meismer is an appointee to the Senate, a little bit of a cloud of controversy over the appointment. And he does have a Republican opponent. We'll talk a little bit about that. But Terrence Everett, who is in a Wake County district, generally speaking, I think if there's even a little tiny Democratic wave, it's more likely to help a Democratic incumbent in a metropolitan area. And so we'll have to see if Everett's seat. But there are a couple of Democrats running in the primary for the chance to run against Everett, including some that would have the capacity to put a significant amount of personal money into the race. So we'll see. But these are the 4 races that would really matter. And so to some extent, Democrats need to win 2 of these 4 to hold the supermajority. In the House, these are the races that are considered to be most significant in terms of the competitiveness. You can see the districts are pretty closely aligned. But again, for the Republicans to maintain the supermajority, they've got to win all of the seats that lean their way, and then 6 of these 7 to get to a supermajority, 5 to get back to the practical supermajority, or 71, 1 short of the supermajority. So it's just incredibly competitive. Just a handful of districts that are in play where things will matter. In all likelihood, a ton of money coming into these races because of the potential shift in the balance of power in the North Carolina General Assembly as a result. Now, the key races to watch: Senator Phil Berger, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, facing a very serious primary challenge in his own district from the sheriff of Rockingham County, Sam Page. Some part of the combination of factors, Berger sort of characterized locally. He's got a son on the state Supreme Court. He's got another son who's a county commissioner in Rockingham. He's got a daughter that works for the state of North Carolina, the Office of Administrative Hearings. And so some part of the pushback at the local level may be more about that dynamic than anything else. But Senator Berger was very conspicuous in a push to expand the number of casinos in the state. So some portion of the Republican base that may not feel casinos are a positive public policy for the state feel strongly about that. And then a kerfuffle that erupted in the last session with the shrimp trawlers, where Senator Berger was part of a Senate initiative to try to ban trawling for some period of time. And the shrimp fishermen got really active in this. Some of the polling that's floated out shows Senator Berger behind Sheriff Page at this point. It's seemingly difficult for me to imagine that Phil Berger would lose a Republican primary. The district includes Rockingham and some part of Guilford County, but all eyes are on this primary race, and it could change the whole dynamic of the Senate either way it goes because of Senator Berger's position as the Senate President pro tem and thus the leader of the Republicans in the Senate. And then looking at some of the other matchups, as I mentioned, there's Representative Carla Cunningham. She's now facing a challenge in her primary in a district that's very likely to produce a Democratic incumbent. But Governor Stein's now endorsed Rodney Sadler in that race. More Republicans had primary challenges than Democrats did, interestingly enough. Jimmy Dixon has a Democratic opponent in a district in Duplin, part of Wayne County. Interestingly enough, Dixon has endorsed the primary opponent of a fellow House Republican, Keith Kidwell. Dixon endorsed Darren Armstrong over an issue involving the Farm Bill and the issue of whether or not subsequent litigation around the Roundup, the possible carcinogenic impact of Roundup. And so this was sort of in caucus fighting on the House side. But interestingly enough, Senator Brent Jackson now faces an opponent, William Barber, who is the husband of Marcella Barber, who is taking on Jimmy Dixon. So I don't remember another husband-wife combo in legislative races, but that may be the first time. There we have Mike Hager, who was a member of the House and was a majority leader in the caucus, Republican caucus. He's become a lobbyist, and now he's taken on the incumbent Republican back home, which has caused a lot of tension. Jake Johnson there has gotten the support of the speaker, and so it created complications. But it very likely to be a very competitive primary up in the mountains. Then I mentioned before, Chris Measer facing a Republican primary challenge from Kevin Crutchfield. He's a former House member who lost re-election last time, is now trying to get back in the Senate. So the fact that more Republicans are facing primaries, I think, becomes a factor in this election. Other on the ballot, statewide race, our quarter state Supreme Court, Anita Earls, the Democratic incumbent, Sarah Stevens, a current House member, running against her. Earls just announced she's under treatment for breast cancer, but would continue to campaign and be involved in the election campaign. This race does not have the potential to change the partisan balance of our state Supreme Court, currently 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats. So maybe not as much attention in this race as there have been in other cycles where our Supreme Court campaigns were really about the partisan control of the courts. Court of Appeals, 2 incumbents running for re-election, and a third that's an open seat race. There's a primary in the Republican running against John Arrowood, the incumbent. All of the incumbents are in italics. That's how I designate it. And then in the open seat race, no Republican primary, and then a Democratic primary. But in the Toby Hampson, who's the current occupier of that appellate court seat, George Bell. So there's no primary there, just a general election. All right, real quick, running a little late, but we'll get over this. What do the 2 parties hope? Well, the Democrats are really hoping for a traditional wave, meaning a lot of the independent-minded voters end up supporting the Democratic candidate. That's what they're hoping for. And Republicans are really hoping for Trump voters to make sure the Trump people, folks that are loyal to the president, turn out and vote for Republican candidates. The Democrats hoping Roy Cooper at the top of the ticket is just amazing as a candidate, and that helps other Democrats. Republicans really hoping for the opposite of that. I think the Democrats have stated that their goal is simply to break the supermajority in both chambers. I don't think the Democrats at this point really think realistically taking majorities of either chambers is realistic as far as they see it at this point. But breaking that supermajority hold that the Republicans have is the ultimate goal. I think Republicans don't want any of those hotly contested primary races in the legislature to produce a lot of incumbents who might otherwise been able to go out and raise money in support of other Republican candidates are not able to do that because they lose their primaries. And so I think the Republicans are hopeful that those challenges don't actually prove to unseat the incumbent. Again, it's just not a lot of voters that are willing to cross over. So I'm not sure wave dynamics are actually even possible anymore in a modern American and North Carolina politics. A lot of stuff might influence voter attitudes if we had a significant downturn of the economy. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on in the world. If we had some, unfortunately, significant military event somewhere around the world that went really bad or really well, that could ultimately change. We'll see how things like what's happened in Venezuela, and if ultimately the United States gets involved with Iran, that has the potential to impact voter attitudes. Some shift in the way that traditional groups have historically thought of themselves. Donald Trump saw a growth in the percentage of Hispanic and Black voters that supported his candidacy. And so we continue to see that dynamic. And again, the Democrats still have to develop a very solid message to the president. That sense of the political consultants say, don't campaign on anti-Trump, campaign on affordability and talk about what we're going to do to increase wages and decrease prices. We'll see if Democrats have that kind of sentiment. And of course, the 2026 election, as much as anything about the 2028 election, and open seat race for president, not really clear. A lot of Democrats have expressed an interest. Will be a battleground state in all likelihood in the presidential contest. So we'll see a lot of those candidates here. We'll have a U.S. Senate race where Ted Budd, the current other Republican senator, will be on the ballot again for reelection in all likelihood. Josh Stein, the Democratic governor, will be on the ballot in all likelihood again. So a very robust ballot in 2028, a lot of hotly contested races. And of course, all of the council of state seats will be on the ballot. The 9 other than the governor's races that we'll see. Whether or not there's any retirements there, it might make an open seat race in a council of state contest a little bit more competitive. And again, all the congressional seats will be back on the ballot as well. So what do we know? Real summarizing really good. Generational changes are taking place in our politics. So some of it is more or less predictable because it's more different than it's been in the past. We continue to see the state grow and change in the sense that people have of what it means to be a Democrat or Republican is changing, and our economy is globalizing. So people's perspective on what matters to them on a fiscal basis is a lot more global than it has been historically in North Carolina. And I think sort of as a concluding thought, the influence of social media in our politics is like the rest of our culture. People are increasingly isolated and only getting content that reinforces the notions that they have of politics, such as it is. And it's made it harder, I think, for us to understand what really might potentially motivate a voter because people are increasingly not public in the way that they think of or discuss or debate their politics. And entrenchment's a lot easier if the only information you're getting is supporting the ideas and conclusions you've already drawn. So unfortunately, our politics is going to be influenced by the rise of social media, I think, for at least another decade or so. Perhaps a younger generation of Americans will find a way to break through. And that's a little over time. I'm sorry. It's just a dynamic election cycle. But I'm glad to take any questions if somebody wants to type something in. If not, we've recorded this and we'll be sending it out on Friday through the Raleigh Report. So anybody that wants to view this content can see it and watch it at their leisure. And again, we'll plan other webinars, probably one again right before the primary on March 3rd, maybe right after the primary to talk about the matchups for the general election. And then again, sometime in late fall as we talk about what's shaping up to be the key factors to determine what's likely to happen in the general election. And then undoubtedly something the day after the election as well, talk about what actually happened. But again, for all of you that are supporters of our Political Action Committee, IPAC, thank you so much. It makes possible our support of candidates for the General Assembly, both Democrats and Republicans that are aligned with us on key issues that matter to the independent insurance agency business model. We maintain those positive working relationships with the legislature, not just through those members of the House and Senate that have experience as insurance agents or in the insurance industry, but we count on the support, financial support of their political campaigns for them to know that we're serious and want to have conversations when issues arise that we're interested in. And so your PAC contribution makes that possible. And I'm grateful for your willingness to make those contributions. So thank you very much for those of you that are IPAC contributors. And if you're not, you can go on our website, iianc.com/PAC and make your IPAC contribution today. And I see no questions. It seems like everybody's satisfied with what we've discussed here today. And with that, I wish you a happy day and enjoy the rest of your week. And I will see you again soon.